Oh, hello. You just caught me doing a bit of light reading on Gallifreyan history. If you haven't seen our entry on that yet, you probably should. Across a very niche circle of Wilderness Years novel enjoyers, this novel, Alien Bodies, is like gold dust, a story in very high demand due to its quality. So going into this one, it's safe to say that I had some very high expectations, and I'm glad to say that I was not disappointed. Before we talk about the story, we do have to acknowledge its author, Lawrence Miles, a name that is like Marmite to this niche circle. Either you think that he's quite good, or that he's quite bad, and that's not me commenting on his writing, which is pretty unanimously agreed to be exceptional. No, it's him as a person. Miles is quite infamous for being brought down by his arrogance, his ego, and a distinct lack of tact. Every interview that he does is like an open book. Every single thought that he has is there in print. You want to know what he thinks of this writer, or of that story? Yeah, you can find out. And it's strangely refreshing to see someone as open as this, even if it does mean that he annoyed most of the writers to high heaven, to the point where his only friend or ally among them was Jim Mortimer, who is himself quite not a great figure at the moment. Miles is a very honest person by nature, but that of course means that he broke the unwritten rule of you don't criticise other writers and their work so openly. Now I must stress this, everything that I am about to say about Miles himself and about other writers, the sources are from his perspective. They are interviews with him and not other writers, so it will be incredibly biased, so please do keep that in mind. His first misstep was in regards to Kate Orman and Jonathan Blum, two people whose names I know I got wrong in the Vampire Science review, but I'll correct that later. His first misstep, yes, was in regards to them, where in an interview he says about their later novel, Unnatural History, which features Faction Paradox, who originate from this book, that they didn't do the faction right, they didn't do them justice. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with him airing his opinion like this. I mean, at the end of the day, it's his creation. He's got a right to say, well, this isn't how I would have done it. But at the time, this was something that was really quite shocking. Later, there were accusations of him being misogynistic towards Orman specifically, which I'll say now from an outsider's perspective are completely unfounded. He does take the mick out of her, yes, that is known, but it's something that he does with everyone. He hasn't targeted Orman specifically because she's a woman. Also because he's such a massive proponent for LGBT+ rights and gender rights, etc. Yeah, I find it quite hard to believe that he targeted Orman specifically because of her gender. It just feels so out of character. The specific argument that he's misogynistic refers to the time that he used his argument of sacred cows and Kate Orman in the same sentence, so people thought that he was calling her basically a cow. For later on, sacred cows refers to the idea of certain Doctor Who concepts being untouchable to writers. They're so entrenched that any writer would feel weird to change them or feel out of place. The main ones that spring to mind are Gallifrey, Regeneration, and the overall image of the Doctor. Yeah, it's strange how these feel so relevant today. If you want to know more about this at a deeper level, right from the source, I'll leave all my sources in the description. They're primarily various interviews over the years with Miles that one night I just went on a massive deep dive into and came out with a sore jaw from laughing and a dumbfounded look on my face. They're great, and provide an insight into an era that I wasn't a part of because, well, I wasn't born yet, so I just find it absolutely ludicrous that this stuff went on. The final things I'll touch on in regards of this gossip are three main adversaries, I guess, of Miles. Stephen Moffat, who of course would go on to become showrunner from 2010 to 2017, who once drunkenly said that deep down you know that Alien Bodies is the best thing you've ever written, and you know nothing you write is ever going to have the same impact again. Well, now I think what Moffat was really trying to say is that this is a beautiful piece of work. You know, it is the tip-top of fiction, you've written something fantastic. But of course he was a bit drunk at the time, so it does come off as a bit abrasive and doesn't carry what I think he actually meant. You also have to remember that this came out before some of Miles' later work, such as Dead Romance and The Adventures of Henrietta Street, some of the most well-regarded entries to their various series. Miles took issue with this because he sees himself as someone who is perpetually improving. Every work will be better than his last, especially when you compare it to his first one, which, yeah, you can see isn't as good, especially compared to Alien Bodies. For the most part, yeah, Miles does manage to stick to this. He is a writer that perpetually evolves and becomes better with each work. So, of course, naturally, he just took a bit of issue with this. He doesn't necessarily hate Moffat as such, and recognises that he is a good TV writer, but I think this is something that did stick with him for quite a long time. The next is Paul Cornell, who Miles rather offensively, if anything, refers to as Shagger Cornell. Yeah, if you really want to know why Miles calls him this, then just read the interviews. I'm not going to go into it. The last of the adversarial trio is Gary Russell, who Miles criticises for, and rather rightfully so, putting just way too many continuity references in his work to the point where it just feels like he's screaming, "Look at me, I know so much about Doctor Who." This isn't just my opinion either. Many people agree with Miles to the point where Russell's novel Divided Loyalties is regarded as one of the worst Doctor Who novels to ever exist, up there with Time Worm Genesis. Miles being so outspoken about his dislike for Russell's work does mean that he was covertly blacklisted from Big Finish for quite a while, though this does seem to have been relaxed later on, as in 2008 he wrote the Bernie Summerfield story The Adolescence of Time, so evidently some kind of switch up there happened where he was allowed back on. Mind you, Russell wasn't executive producer at Big Finish anymore, as he was now script editor of the revived series, so that's probably what changed things. So, that's Miles as a person, but what's he like as a writer? Well, he's nothing short of phenomenal. My issue with Miles is that he writes like poetry. Every line is purposeful, every line feels incredibly rich to read. Right from the beginning, comparing this to the previous novels feels like night and day. This is by far the best thing in the range I have read so far. So why is this my issue if I can do nothing but praise his writing? Well, because you can just feel the ego seeping out of it. Alien Bodies is most famous for establishing two main concepts for the rest of the range, the first being the War in Heaven, or as it's here known, the War, and of course Faction Paradox. Both of these concepts are one of those things in Doctor Who where you know if you're hearing them, you've just gone off the deep end in terms of the lore, but they are absolutely incredible, so let's go through them individually. The War in Heaven is essentially the Time War before the Time War, but it's significantly more effective in its execution. As a concept, it feels mystical and secretive. The significant lack of information we have on it means it feels like it's something intangible, it's left up to the imagination of the reader. That is compared to The Last Great Time War, which feels more mechanical, grungy, and quite basic in comparison. Miles is credited for creating the War in Heaven, but the concept of a time war comes from the comic The 4D War, written by Alan Moore, of Watchmen fame, V for Vendetta, and so many other projects. Miles essentially took this concept of a time war and absolutely ran with it. He claims that his intention with putting it in here was for later writers to use in their own novels, but not many did until the end of Stephen Cole's tenure as series editor. I'm sorry, but I just don't believe this thinking whatsoever. There's no way that Miles invented this and thought, yeah, this is something that won't have any lasting consequences and will be maybe used a couple of times. He's quoted as saying it was never intended to become a large arc, but that's just absolutely ridiculous. You've challenged some of the biggest sacred cows in all of Doctor Who. You've given a premise that's so good it would generate its own spin-off. Like, you can't have thought this was just nothing. This is really where I feel that Miles' ego seeps out into the writing. I can't really tell if he's throwing in these concepts because he was told to, or because he wants to reinvent the entire Doctor Who universe, something which, for a while, he was kind of successful at. Let's get on to Faction Paradox, and now I know that saying Faction Paradox makes you seem like a bit of a sad git, but you can really see after reading this why it became its own spin-off. Unlike most things in Doctor Who, they're not something that feels complete after showing up in just one story and then that's it. Maybe they get a couple of repeats in the future, a comeback in the revived series, but after that there's not really much to do with them. No, they're something that's wholly unique, they're interesting, and most importantly have a latchable... Latchable? Is that a word? A latchable character in Cousin Justine, who would go on to become the main character of the Faction Paradox audios. I've spent this long without actually talking about the content of the novel itself. What the hell have I been doing? Alright, let's get on to that then. Each chapter is 16 pages long, with there being 7 10-page flashbacks interlaced throughout the story, all of which are just incredible. Each flashback was written by Miles at the end of the book, which is why he describes one in particular, being Mr. Quixote's story, as a truly nasty piece of cack, though after reading it I really don't agree, it's pretty alright. The entire plot revolves around one singular thing, the relic, the biodata of a Time Lord. Our local time-travelling wheeler-dealer, Mr. Quixote, has managed to get possession of the relic, and this gives him the perfect opportunity to gain power. All of the temporal powers from the future inside of the war want it, and they will do anything to secure it. So he sets up an auction, creates a localised time bubble around a nice ziggurat for window dressing, and invites all the top dogs from the war, each being allowed 2 representatives. The Time Lord Homunculette with his TARDIS Marie, Cousin Justine and little brother Manuel from Faction Paradox, the undead Mr. Trask, the Shift, who is a being of thought, Colonel Cortez and Lieutenant Bregman, who are the odd ones out as they're not from a temporal power but instead just humans, and finally the Daleks, who are killed by the Croton E-Kobolds, an interesting addition. Of course, what shall derail this entire auction is the surprise appearance of the Doctor and Sam, who won't be too happy when he finds out exactly what the relic is. I absolutely adore this premise. Miles makes sure that the entire story is character-driven and not propped up by making returning characters appear. This is best shown by the reappearance of the Daleks, who, as I said, are killed by a Croton of all things. Perhaps the strangest monster to return, and that's what makes them so perfect. It's not like anybody really cares about Croton lore. The thing is, each character is memorable in their own right. Each member of the auction feels like they've had just enough time to fully explore them, even if we don't learn everything about someone to keep them a little bit mysterious. And that's primarily because the whole thing is 313 pages compared to the usual 280. I think it's really telling when the least interesting characters of his are the ones that are human. Where Miles really shines is writing aliens, things out of the ordinary, and this is best shown through the Shift. As he is a being of pure concept, the way that he communicates with people is through mimetic speech. Say you're looking at a newspaper, all the words on a page will shift to be what he wants to say. Let's say you don't have something readable on hand. Well, take a look at this wooden table, for example. Oh. Now this doesn't mean that the human characters are boring, because I reckon this is the first novel since Vampire Science to actually get Sam right. He doesn't write her a romance subplot or sexualize anything, he just writes her like a regular person. In fact, the only sexual thing in the novel is something that's not only in character, but between adults. Thank God for that. We get a very interesting setup for later novels where Sam has 2 sets of biodata in her, like 2 versions of history vying for control. I do wonder if that'll be followed up later. Though I must say that the primary character she does interact with is female. It's a bit like the classic series. Don't worry, Joe, there's a female Thal that you can talk to while we men talk business and fight off the Daleks. Yeah, that was my John Pertwee impression, if you couldn't tell. It was the 90s, you can only go so far. The 2 humans, as I said, are Colonel Cortez and Lieutenant Bregman. Cortez is pretty mental, and apart from being the setup to an admittedly quite funny joke during the auction, which, by the way, is my absolute favourite chapter of the entire novel, because it's when the auction actually starts, and the members of the auction start freaking out when they learn who the Doctor really is. But Cortez, apart from that very specific joke, doesn't really do much in the entire novel, and this is where Bregman steps in as the more interesting and developed of the 2. Bregman really gets more to do, and that's particularly expanding the characters around her, especially little brother Manuel. If you can't tell already, yeah, I think this is a straight 10 out of 10. I implore absolutely everyone watching to please pick it up and read it. Even if you haven't read any of the EDAs before, if you're a Doctor Who fan, you will enjoy this. I'll leave a link in the description to the web archive version, as good bloody luck getting it physically for a decent price. I cannot applaud Miles enough for this story. He reintroduced a proper mysticism to the Doctor that we haven't seen since the end of the classic series, and tackled such huge and interesting concepts with such ease. Hell, he managed to make the Crotons of all things interesting, genuinely the only Doctor Who story that I've ever just stopped watching. Well done, Lawrence. though he does keep using the term natch, which is short for naturally. Natch. Yeah, the 90s were a strange time. It's a bit like putting 6-7 into a Doctor Who novel. Oh god, that would be hell. The day that happens, I'm stopping this channel, genuinely. Anyways, whoever is writing next times really has a lot to live up to, and I quite hope that they do. But until then, thanks for watching.